All right, hi there, everyone. Welcome to my first lecture on biological scales. So let's get into it. Today's going to be a brief lecture. I'm just going to talk about three major topics on scales in biology: temporal scales, spatial scales, and scales of biological organization. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how that frames the questions we ask in biology, which is going to lead into eventually a discussion of energy flow through biological systems. And at that point, I'll pass it off to Roja. So anytime you're thinking about a biological question, you should be keeping in mind both temporal and spatial scales. So we've got two good examples here. On this graph, what we have on the horizontal x-axis is time in years. And on the vertical y-axis, we have CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. The data is represented by this red trace here. And what you can see is that there's a pattern of generally increasing CO2 concentrations in our atmosphere. Now, the important part of this graph is that it underscores the importance of temporal scale, because if you chose, say, 1 month as your temporal scale, depending on which month you were looking at, you might see an increase in CO2 concentration, a decrease in CO2 concentration, or no change at all. And that's because there's a seasonal rise and fall of CO2 every year. So what you need to do is you need to be able to match up the time scale that you're looking at appropriately to the overall question. So if you're looking at changes due to climate change, you really need a long data set to address something like that. You can't be looking at small seasonal differences. You need to be looking at sort of decadal changes in CO2. So that is an example of the importance of temporal scale. Over here, we have spatial scale, and this GIF here shows everything from the atomic molecular level up to the cellular level. And it shows, even though we think of the cell as a very small unit biologically, there's so much diversity underneath at those smaller spatial scales. And we'll be going through a lot of these in the next few weeks as we start off with the topics that Roja's talking about. So temporal and spatial scales are always important. The third one are scales of biological organization. So in this class, we're going to take you through everything from the molecular up to the cell, tissue, organ, all the way up to the individual organism as a whole. And then we're even going to go past that into populations, communities, ecosystems, and we'll end it off on the biosphere as a whole. So as we go through these different topics, I want you to keep in mind, what scale are we on? What spatial scale, what temporal scale, and what scale of biological organization are we in each lecture? All right. Okay, so now armed with this idea of scales, I want to turn a little bit to, well, what sort of questions are we going to be asking, and what kind of questions are we going to be exploring in biology? Well, before we get into the formal science of biology, I want to stress that all the questions that we're going to be addressing start off with careful observation of patterns in nature, being able to see how different biological patterns in the world around us look. So here are some examples. Up in this panel here, we have a high alpine meadow. And so the pattern might be, where do you find grass and where do you not find grass, right? Maybe it's because of sun, maybe it's because of water, maybe it's because of grazers. But the first thing is, where is the grass and where is not the grass? That's the pattern. You have to be able to observe a pattern. Over in the other panel on the top there, we've got those freshwater jellyfish in Southeast Asia. They go up and down in the water column every day. And so, again, observing a pattern. How do they move through time? Why are they aggregating? You can get into the reasons why later, but the first thing is, can you identify the pattern? In the middle here is a really cool microscope image where they've stained it and they're looking at individual cells in a larval zebrafish. And so you can see how those cells contribute to the overall body form of that fish. So again, we're looking at patterns in biology. That is something that you're going to need throughout this term. To get a little bit more specific, the patterns can be morphological. So here we have leaves from different species of tree. They all have the general form, right? They all have veins and they all have the shape of a leaf, but each species has sort of a different take on the distribution of those veins. So morphological patterns have a long history in biology, as do behavioral patterns. So fish swimming in a tight torus, we call it, and maybe that's to protect them from predators, but regardless of the reason why, the first observation is how they are behaviorally swimming. So morphological patterns, behavioral patterns, there's all sorts of patterns in the natural world, and that is your first job as a biologist, is to make careful observations of nature. But that's not where it ends. In modern biology, it's not good enough just to observe patterns. So that is the first part of it. You have to be able to identify patterns, which here I'm defining as repeatable phenomena. But the other piece is to be able to show which processes underlie those patterns, which processes drive those patterns. Sometimes we call processes mechanisms. What mechanisms lead to the formation of a pattern? And so there's this interplay between pattern and process. Can you identify the overall biological pattern, and can you show which processes lead to the formation of that pattern? That is something that's going to come up over and over and over again in this class and in your biological career. So here's an example. You might look at muscle contraction and relaxation, right? Motion. So the pattern is motion, right? You're moving your muscles, and that's the basis of movement. What's the process that drives that motion? Well, it's a complex phenomena where you're looking at neurons being excited and going out to the periphery and actually causing the contractions in the muscles. So it's more of a nervous system process that's underlying the pattern of muscle contraction and motion, right? So pattern and process, they're linked here. Here's an example from something more close to what I do. These are marine snails that I picked up in Maine, on the coast of Maine, on the East Coast. And the predatory snails, and you can see there's dramatic differences in the color of those shells. So something as simple as the pattern of color is a good starting place. Now, why are they that color? Could it be from diet? Could it be from predators? Could it be from different cool versus hot habitats? Those are the potential processes that cause the pattern of differences in color. So color is the pattern, and the processes are these different mechanisms that might cause those differences in color. So there's all sorts of different questions. Most of them all start off with some identification of a natural pattern in nature. And why is all of this important? Pattern and process. You're going to see those paired a lot in this class. Well, it gets to, well, what does it take to explain something, right? And that's in biology, but that's just in life in general. If you look into the philosophers, they'll have arguments about what constitutes a good explanation. And I'm not going to get too deeply into that question. That's not that type of class. I'm just going to leave you with this, that in biology, one of the common ways that we explain things is by citing a mechanism, right? If you can cite a mechanism, a process, that causes a pattern. You both know the cause, right? The mechanism that causes it, and the conditions under which that mechanism works. And so this is one way that is common in biology of explanation by mechanism. So there are other ways of explaining and knowing, but this is a common one. So you'll recognize that as we give you some examples through the term. Okay, so where's that leave us? Patterns in biology. I've talked too long about that. There's a million different types of patterns out there in the natural world, and we're always seeking to try to explain their occurrence. One way I like to look at biology before we get too deep into it is that there are these different subfields of biology, everything from the small scale at the molecular level to the large scale at the ecology and evolution. And if you look at the department and Carleton, the different professors work on different parts of these subfields. So you've got people who work in ecology and evolution at the large scale. You've got someone like me who does ecological physiology, so I'm kind of in the middle there. And then we've got someone like Jennifer Wolf, who does developmental biology, how organisms go from a fertilized egg all the way up to an adult. Interesting field. And we've got a lot of people who work on the smaller scales, molecular and cellular biology, all of these mechanisms that drive everything in biology. And that's where Roja's domain resides. And I think it's interesting and important to say, we all have these different subfields, but none of us are kind of stuck in just one of these silos. Usually we cross a little bit of barrier between these different subfields. We don't often work on all the subfields at once, but usually everyone crosses one or two of these subfields. And so as you're going through this course, we're going to take you through all these different subfields, all these different scales. And I want you to think about which of these speak the most to you. Which are the questions that you find interesting, because you may not work on all of it. You're going to have to go through all of it in this course, but keep your eyes and ears open and try to decide, where do you fit in this biological spectrum, because everyone has areas that they find more or less interesting. Oh, and the other thing is that one person's process is another person's pattern. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at me, I'm a physiologist. I'm interested in things like respiration. And so I'm interested in the environmental conditions that control respiration, right? Dad's an ecologist, so he might say respiration just creates CO2. So CO2 is more of a nutrient cycling pattern, and respiration is just a process. But then Mark might say, well, nutrient cycling can cause changes evolutionarily in organisms. They can lead to different adaptations. So evolutionary change is the pattern, and nutrient cycling is simply the process. So everyone's pattern and process might be different as you go up and down these subfields. So think about that a little bit. You know, we've got these different subfields, but those are sort of human constructs. I like this quote here by a famous biologist talking about, we have these different subfields that we make up as scientists, but the organisms don't know that. And so always try to think a little bit larger than just these subfields. But it's a good place, I think, when you're starting in Bio 126 to try to sort of categorize what you're seeing in class. All right, so there's lots of patterns out there in the natural world. There's lots of diversity on the planet Earth. And so the question is, well, how do we describe all this diversity? How do you describe life, basically? And there are different ways of doing that. I think in the Intro Bio series here at Carleton, we show you two very different ways of looking at life in the Bio 125 class and then the Bio 126 class, and they complement each other. So Bio 125, we talk about biology as information flowing through these different biological systems, a lot of it at the genetic level, leading to the building of organisms. And here's my one story about information and biology that I love. So back in the 60s, there was a researcher at NIH who was researching the idea of the information in RNA and how it leads to amino acids within proteins, and did a really cool experiment where at 3 in the morning, he made a long string of just uracil bases, U. And then from that, they produced a predictable sequence of the same amino acid over and over and over again, which then leads to this idea of the triplet code here that's leading to the basis of protein construction. So they do this experiment. He goes over to Europe, to Moscow, and he gives his results at a conference. And not very many people are attending his conference, but a few people do hear about it, and word spreads through the conference about this amazing result. Francis Crick of Crick and Watson fame, they start to hear about this, and they give him a chance to give the talk again. This time it's a packed room full of everybody, and he gives his talk. Comes back a conquering hero. When he comes back to his lab, they have this banner waiting for him. You are a great Marshall. So just an example of information flowing through biological systems. But here in this class, what we're going to talk about this term is the flow of energy through biological systems. And so one of the fundamental aspects of biology are that organisms must figure out how to acquire and use energy. It's through every living organism is faced with this challenge. And so we're going to be talking about a wide diversity of biological systems. Some of them are what we call autotrophs, and some of them are called heterotrophs. So something like a photoautotroph are plants that get their energy from the sun, and then they can do photosynthesis, and we will talk about that at great length. And then other organisms are heterotrophs, and so they're getting their energy from consuming other organisms, and we will talk about those organisms a bunch. So this is a good spot to hand it off to Roja. These two forms of making a living in biology are going to be the subject of what we talk about for the next few weeks. So this will get us kicked off onto energy flow through biological systems. All right, so that's it for today. I'll have some practice questions on Friday, and we'll see you there. All right, bye.